My beloved favorite game of all time, Super Mario RPG, finally got the faithful remake it deserves after 27 years. This ground-up Unity rewrite by Arte Piazza is so faithful that party stats, enemy stats, and even damage formulas are, with a few exceptions, exactly the same. One thing that did change, however, is some of the windows for action commands. For the uninitiated, action commands are a battle mechanic that allows the player to deal extra damage or take less damage from an enemy if they press a button at just the right time during an attack animation. The system was created by director Yoshihiko Maekawa as a way of keeping the player in the driver's seat during turn-based combat that was at the time seen by RPG critics as too autopilot-y. Your characters and enemies more or less use the same attacks that they used in the original game, but the time at which you should press the button changed for some attacks. This was sort of hard for me to adjust to as a veteran of the original game, but thankfully the game provides you with training wheels in the form of indicators that tell you when to press the button, lasting until you've started to master it. If you forget the timings anyway, we've got you covered, check the video description. So speaking of timings that may or may not have changed, this brings us to the elephant in the room.
Oh yeah.
No, not that one.
Uh-oh.
I'm talking about Mario's Super Jump. Super Jump is one of 3 spells in the game that allows you to keep chaining consecutive action commands over and over again until you miss one, which ends your turn. The most you can do in one turn is 100, at which point the game stops accepting further inputs and unlocks a special prize for you to pick up. The 100 Super Jump side quest is talked about by a lot of fans as a personal white whale, being the one thing that they were never able to finish, especially by fans who've played the game countless times. In fact, Retro Achievements users had some pretty mixed opinions when 100 Super Jumps was added as an achievement to Super Mario RPG. So why is this technique so hard? Well, firstly, the technique starts off by lulling you into a false sense of security. The first action command you do during Super Jump has a window so large that you can't miss it unless you just don't press anything. However, with each successive input, that window gets smaller and smaller until you only have 3 frames to hit it from the 13th input onward. The end of the input window never changes, so it does maintain a consistent rhythm, but it expects you to find it. But in a 60 FPS game, 3 frames is 1/20th of a second, and you have to hit it 87 times in a row. To put that into perspective, most human beings take about 1/4 of a second to react to visual stimuli, which is 5 times as long as a 20th of a second. This difference is not as staggering when the stimulus is something that you have a rough idea of when it's going to happen in advance, but even then, a 20th of a second is still a tall order. So if you went into your Super Jump research looking for it to be a reaction-based thing rather than a rhythm-based endurance thing, I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but I would wish you very good luck with that. Secondly, the game doesn't really tell you if you were too early or too late when you drop jumps, which adds a psychological factor to its difficulty that has led to the propagation of all sorts of rumors. And just to clear the air on some of those rumors, the timing for Super Jump does not change partway through. It's still a constant rhythm for all 100 jumps as long as you're aiming for the end of the window every time, and also it is not a frame perfect trick. But because the game doesn't really give you any feedback on why you drop your jumps, a lot of people still believe those things because what's the game gonna do, tell you you're wrong? So the 100 Super Jump side quest is effectively a minigame that requires an immense amount of focus to repeatedly execute a very unforgiving input with no room for error and also no feedback. So yeah, it's pretty hard, but not impossible. Everyone going for a competitive time in speedruns of Super Mario RPG has learned how to do it fairly consistently with a bit of practice. You don't need to be a god gamer, you just need endurance training. I made a tutorial video in 2016 about how to do this in the Super Nintendo version that I put in this video description. Some people have found it helpful, you can find it there. But even with tutorials, it's still hard, and it's a technique that to this day eludes many players. So why are so many people getting it now for the first time on the Switch release after 27 years of failure? Did it change that much with the remake's fresh rewrite of action commands? Let's explore that. In the Super Nintendo version, we know that the tightest frame window, which lasts for most of the 100 jumps, is 3 frames, or 1/20th of a second, and we know this because we can verify it in emulators with frame advancing. The game will accept an input on one of these 3 frames, but if you're a frame early or a frame late, your attack just ends. Now for the Switch version, at the time of releasing this video, frame advancing isn't a thing you can really do with emulators. However, because the game is written in Unity, that makes it somewhat easy to reverse engineer in a different way. You can find the steps for this in the video description if you're interested in exploring the game's code yourself, but for this video, we're just going to focus on the end result and look at some decompiled code in Super Mario RPG Remake. The data for attacks that have tapering success windows like Super Jump, Ultra Jump, and Star Rain includes a property called Succeed Frames, which is an array. An array is basically an indexed list of values, so the first value is 0, the second value is 61, the third value is 31, so on and so forth. This data was found by community member Ishokola, and you can find a link to her work in the description. So the game uses this function called battle action command loop data get succeed frame, that's a mouthful, which it uses to fetch the number of frames during which it should allow you to input an action command and have the game deem it successful, based on how many successful action commands you've already done this turn. So going back to what this array actually includes, it means that your initial input of Super Jump, your 0th jump so to speak, doesn't really have a window since you executed it by just selecting the attack. But your first successful action command has a lenience window of 61 frames, your second successful action command has a lenience window of 31 frames, your third has a lenience window of 27 frames, so on and so forth, decreasing right up until your 14th successful action command, which has a lenience window of 3 frames. Going back to the C code, we can see that if we've done more than 14 successful timed hits, it should just use the last value in the array, which is, once again, 3 frames! So there you have it. Just like in the original game, super jumping in the remake is still 3 frames in a 60 FPS game, or 1/20th of a second, just like on Super Nintendo. So that also means if you can do 100 jumps in one release of the game but not the other, it probably isn't the game. But that's kind of the point. Although the technical data says that these two attacks are the same, super jumping is not strictly a numbers game. You only need to hit the 3-frame window once to know that you can do it in theory. That's the quote-unquote easy part. I mean, as easy as anything related to super jumping can really be. The harder part is all the psychology surrounding this action, and that actually does differ between the two releases of Super Mario RPG. In the remake, there's another interesting property of this attack, which is called Succeed Start Frames. This is a corollary to Succeed Frames, as in this property tells the game how long it should wait before the successful action command window can begin. If we compare them, we see 49 frames waiting and 3 frames input window, 48 frames waiting and 4 frames input window, 47 frames waiting and 5 frames input window, 41 frames waiting and 11 frames input window, 33 frames waiting and 19 frames input window. Each of these all add up to 52 frames, indicating that Super Jump still maintains a constant rhythm. And it also tells us that the rhythm is a little bit slower than on Super Nintendo. 52 frames for a Super Jump comes to around 69 BPM, compared that to around 80 BPM on the Super Nintendo. So there's one difference so far. Super Jumping is slower on Switch than on Super Nintendo because the time between Super Jumps is longer. In fact, Super Jumps are so much slower on the Switch, the number of fights that employ them in speedrunning has dropped from 10 to 3. Now, when you start consistently getting to higher and higher numbers of super jumps, you start to get more anxious that maybe this is it. This is the time I hit 100. When that happens, every successful time hit feels deliberate, you get inside your own head, and you're not even sure if the next jump is going to succeed or not. All of these thoughts swirling around in your head are happening in under a second, over and over again, and you almost start to react with surprise to the game telling you each time that yes, you did it correctly again, or nope, sorry, you missed that one. When there's a longer amount of time between super jumps, even if only slightly, this gives your brain a little more time to process the feedback that you hit the timed window correctly, as well as prepare to apply that feedback by doing it again. For some people, this makes super jumping on the Switch easier. It's only a matter of 7 or 8 frames, but when it comes to cognitive psychology and mental processing, every frame matters. Furthermore, the Switch release adds a nice touch to super jumping in that it shows you how close you are to 100. Losing count of your super jumps can be stressful, because trying to recall the last time you were sure of your count and then trying to work backwards to figure out where you are now is an additional mental load to pile onto your brain that's already overworked from trying to understand what the game is trying to tell it about its sense of rhythm. So that means super jumping is a bit easier to do on the Switch version. Doesn't it? Wait a second. Let me think about this a bit more. This extended time between jumps can actually make matters worse. Focusing intently on a specific focal point of the screen for an extended amount of time is not easy from a cognitive psychology standpoint. In fact, doing so for over a minute is quite taxing both on your mind and your eyes. You might notice your eyes start to blur or shake or bug out in between jumps, which is devastating if you're relying on staring at a single point on the screen. When your super jumps are closer together like they are in the Super Nintendo version, the overall task is finished about 12 seconds sooner than on the Switch version, so there's a shorter window of opportunity for your eyes to experience some kind of problem that breaks your focus. Maybe that means Super Nintendo is easier. Let's dig a little deeper. Speaking of breaking focus, just look at the difference here. In the Switch version, there is so much going on visually in between each super jump with the enemy's recoil animation every time you land on it, whereas in the Super Nintendo version, everything stays still, making it easier for you to focus. The only way to get around this is to do the attack on an enemy with a jump immunity, which I guess is fine if you just want to do the technique once just to say you did it, but it kind of sucks if you actually want to use it in battle. So does this mean the Super Nintendo version is easier? On the one hand, despite the visual distractions, the Switch version provides you with some built-in visual cues that didn't exist in the Super Nintendo version, like being able to track Mario's shadow. I don't personally find this too useful because it doesn't work in dark battlefields like 3D Kulaks, but some people swear by it, so I think it counts. But then on the other hand, the Super Nintendo kind of already has this too. Another major difference in the Switch release is that super jumping specifically targets the top of the enemy's head now, as opposed to the center of the enemy's body like it did in Super Nintendo. If you're someone who relies on visual cues, the Super Nintendo at least offered you the ability to find a specific part of the enemy's sprite to focus on and try to react and press the button when Mario passed it, like Johnny's medallion or his outer eye if you're playing on a wireless controller. Super Mario RPG sprites were so accented and perfectly detailed in their pixelation that for the most part, you can find a point to focus on. The Switch version makes you do that instead with empty space or battlefield backgrounds, which I personally find to be less salient as a focal point choice. I think that both games have their pros and cons here, so they each get a point in this department. So jumping off the point about visual cues. Visual cues in the Switch are probably harder to use than in Super Nintendo. On the Super Nintendo, at least if you're playing on the original console with a wired controller and a suitable TV, the feedback that you get from your button presses is fast. No lag whatsoever. Now, of course, this isn't the case if you're playing with a wireless controller on your Wii or Wii U, or a wired controller on a PC emulator, or if you decided to plug your RCA cables directly into an HDMI TV, but for the purposes of this video, we're comparing the hardware that the games were designed for, so we will just stick to talking about that. This top-notch responsiveness can kind of work against you. Remember the frames at which a super jump input could be accepted on Super Nintendo? That's really late in the jump animation, and since Mario lands in the center of the enemy's body, that can be pretty far down on the screen, so when you're preparing to hit the button, Mario's already been on screen for a while, and your mind might not be expecting to have to wait that many frames before doing a timed hit. In my experience, usually when someone is struggling with super jumps on Super Nintendo, it's because they're trying to hit the button a few frames too early, aiming for when Mario is just about to land instead of aiming for when he actually lands. Meanwhile, on Switch, your controller is lagging, full stop. It doesn't matter what controller you have, it doesn't matter if it's wired. In fact, being wired might even be worse. Your controller is lagging by usually about 4 frames on average. Shmup Junkie made an excellent video with research on how different Switch controllers compare in this department, which you can find in the description. So that means if you are failing on Super Nintendo by trying to hit the button a little too early, but you're finding success on the Switch version, it's likely that you're still aiming for just before you expect Mario to land, except now the game is adding a few frames onto your input and it's coming out as registering your input right as he lands, which is correct. This isn't really a universal benefit. This is great for people who are trying to hit the button on Super Nintendo too early, but ridiculously hard for people who knew exactly how to do it on a perfectly responsive SNES controller and now have to consciously adjust for controller lag. I personally use a quite laggy setup because if lag is unavoidable anyway, I may as well use a controller I really like. So when I'm jumping on Johnny, I'm aiming for about here. This is completely alien to me as someone who learned how to speedrun the Super Nintendo game in 2016, so to me, this feels harder. To someone else, it might feel easier. So that about covers it for the differences between the two games. So let's look at the pros of each version. Which one do we think is easier overall? Frankly, I think that neither one is easier. All of these things, except for the controller lag, are psychological, and even that is only beneficial based on how your brain interacts with the presence or absence of controller lag. The easier version of super jumping depends entirely on which of these psychological factors click with you and which ones don't. At the end of the day, Super Nintendo or Switch, it's all about just hitting a 3-frame window 80-something times in a row with no room for error. That's all it is on paper, but there's so much psychology surrounding it that can either help you or hinder you, and in any case will force you to find your placebo. Super jumping is, and always has been, all about finding your placebo. But just remember, in theory, if you can hit 3 frames on one, you can hit 3 frames on the other. If you want to be a completionist, take this knowledge and go and get both of your super suits. If you liked this video, please consider donating to my Super Mario RPG History Preservation Project. I'm collecting Japanese magazines and other print media covering Super Mario RPG, both versions, with the end goal of getting them available to the public on archive.org. Thanks for watching, and good luck getting your 100!